Well, I'll repeat, I was saying at the beginning of the meeting that I love docents so much because you guys are out there on the front line. Now I know that you're not even only at your own museums, but you're outreaching to audiences at other museums when you're visiting. And, I just think it's amazing work I think you, you bring meaning to the experience of going to the museum. So even though I couldn't do it in person, I wanted to make myself available to you to talk about questions that you're hearing, things that you get asked you can't answer, things you're wondering yourself, all of the above. So I have one question, which is, what am I doing now, which I'll go into. But are there any questions specifically about the pieces in your collections? Or, I made all those videos trying to answer all the questions in both metric and what's non-metric, I guess, American measurements. Anyways, because I was like, I get very confused with numbers. So I was like, what is that in kilos? And what is that in pounds? And, so I tried to do all the measurements. The videos that are about each body of work, they talk about the experiences I had and how those experiences led me to make the sculptures and informed my decision making while I was working in the studio. And maybe I'll just start talking a little bit about right now what I'm doing. I would say maybe about 2017 was the first time I exhibited one of my cloud sculptures. And I started doing the research behind those a couple of years beforehand. And, whenever I see something that's amazing, doesn't make sense, or just kind of stumps me, I like to dig in a little deeper to try and understand it. And I was reading about clouds, and I read that a cumulus cloud can weigh up to like between tens to hundreds of tons. And I was like, that's not possible. Because there are clouds floating aimlessly, effortlessly, and weighing so much. So I started to sort of dig into the science of clouds, what they do for our planet environment down here, and what scientists do when they're studying them. So I started working with scientists, understanding what they were studying in clouds. And my idea was, I like to start with things that are very realistic, like both the dress and the kimono in your collection started from real clothing. And I was like, well, how do I start from the real cloud? A long story short, basically, I was able to work with a cloud from their weather modeling program. And they were able to estimate fairly accurately the water weight of that cloud. And that is what informed the weight of the sculpture in at the Biennale. So that was the first one. And it's about a 50% scale carbon in marble. Now I'm making a second cloud in marble, and it's actually in process right now for the U.S. Embassy in Montenegro. I work quite frequently with a program called Art in Embassies, which is an amazing program. It's artists lend work to the State Department, and ambassadors, when they move to their new post, they curate an art exhibition that, when they're hosting people, that, they show like this is, a selection of American art. Some people focus on art from women, some people focus on figurative, all different things. And so on many occasions I've lent a piece, and on the rare occasion, the State Department reaches out when they're rebuilding an embassy or refurbishing an embassy. They reach out to an artist to make a piece for a permanent installation. So the cloud I'm making will go to the U.S. Embassy in Montenegro, and it will be permanently installed there outside the embassy. So that's super exciting. I've never done anything like that before for that program. And so I'm very excited about that. And then I'm also working on an iron cloud made from 100% recycled iron for a sculpture garden in the United States. So that will, those two projects will unfold over the next year or so. And I think what's really interesting to me is like I find that my projects are growing in scale, which means that the pace of how quickly I can complete things is slowing down a little bit. The projects are larger and more complicated. They're going into the public sphere like permanently. So sometimes in a city, and so then that leads to another level of detail. So that's where I'm at now. Then in the studio on a smaller scale, I'm still working on the Nocturnes body of work, doing a lot of drawing. I am I'm actually working with paper, just making sculptures from pure paper. Paper is something that I've always loved. It's one of those like first materials. And when I was living in New York and I was working at Urban Glass, I had an internship at the Dieudonné paper house, paper mill, basically, which is like a not-for-profit devoted to making paper by hand and inviting artists to work with paper. So I would work there assisting the artists. In exchange, I got enough time to make one batch of paper. And I'll never forget this. This was like 1991 or two. So I took an entire outfit of my clothing, because paper is made from cloth fiber originally. And like rag pickers were taking discarded clothing and selling them like as raw material for paper. So I took an outfit of my clothing, cut it up into 1 by 1 inch squares, so cut it really, really tiny. And then you put it into this big vat and you heat it up. So it was a blue jeans, sweatshirt, t-shirt, socks, and underclothing. And so that entire outfit became so I have a stack of paper that I still have never used for anything. I just thought the paper was so cool from one outfit of clothing. So maybe I'll put that paper to work now that I'm focusing on paper and drawing things.
I'm curious about the paper that you're working with now. So is it going to be like a large scale sculpture or?
Well, yes. So I'm preparing for next summer in June. I'll send out invitations. I'm having a mid-career show at the Munson Museum up in Utica, New York. And it's a fantastic museum with a sort of mid-century, their collection is mid-century modern, so Jackson Pollock, Rothko, like amazing artwork there. And the building was built by Philip Johnson. So it has this sort of, all the galleries are on the rim, and there's this beautiful atrium in the center with all natural lighting. And so my idea is I want to make a cloud or maybe a group of 3 smaller clouds that are floating in that atrium. And so all of my usual materials, like, I don't want to hang glass, there's a lot of things I wouldn't want to do for safety concerns. But then all of a sudden I had this vision of like these like paper, I don't know if you've ever seen, there are Japanese floats where paper is glued onto a structure of basically like very thin straws, like bamboo straws. So I was thinking about constructing a cloud in that way that could float there and hold the light. I mean, the thing of the atrium is the light. So I'm trying to figure out what material I can use that will capture that light, but not way too much.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we have 2 questions over in the chat. Are you able to see those, Karen, or do you want me to read them?
If you could read them, I'm terrified to press any buttons on my. I might mute us or something like that.
I did earlier. Okay, so Laurel wanted to know how long does a human model have to wear the cast before it dries and can be removed?
We get that down to about 40 minutes. And the way we do it is strategic. You need to stand still for the gesture. So we do the plaster on the main part of the body and the limbs, like down to just below the knee and about midway on the arm. And that we can do front and back in 40 minutes, which is fast. But still, I've done it. I've been a model for one of my own pieces. 40 minutes, technically it's pretty fast, but it feels like forever. And then after that, once the model is seated comfortably, then I work on the hands and feet, and that takes more time, but it's much more comfortable. And you can do, one hand or two hands and then 2 feet. So, it's less physically demanding. But that part where you capture the gesture from the torso out to the beginning of the arms, that's about 40 minutes.
Wow. Okay. All right. Then Dawn had a question, and she says, early on when Karen first started creating her art, was there someone or something that inspired you to start creating these bodiless pieces of art?
I love the artwork of Magdalena Abakanowicz. She's I believe she's Polish originally, but her work is widely collected in the States. I have no idea how old she is. I believe she's my senior. But I remember seeing her works, and they were kind of these burlappy, these very rough burlap pieces, and it almost looked like someone had a cloak around them and then just stepped out of it. And they weren't detailed in any way. They weren't really beautiful in any way, but they were really powerful. And so I would say that was one of the artists that I always, you have your sort of thinking board as an artist, which is like you put little postcards up or images of things that are of inspiration to you. And that a postcard from her work was on my thinking board for quite a while when I was just starting out.
That's cool. What was her last name again?
Oh, geez. Abakanowicz. So I can try to spell it. A-B-A-K, maybe A-N-E-I-W-Z or something like that.
Okay.
But Magdalena is her first name, Magdalena Abakanowicz.
I'll Google her later and figure it out.
We had one of her pieces in one of our shows many years ago in the museum, and it was extremely moving. As I recall, she had some connection with World War II, perhaps?
I believe she did. And I think she might have fled Poland. I never studied her life story, but I remember the intensity, for how simple the sculpture was, the intensity was really overwhelming.
So I have a lot of questions, anyways, but something I've always tried to wrap my head around is like, what is the order of the casting to the lost wax process? Is it like plastered, then wax, then something, and then something to glass?
Yes. Okay. So starting from what point should I start from? The time I have the body dressed and everything?
Yes.
Okay. So I arrange the dress on a wax, and the wax is actually hollow, right? Basically, you could think of it like if you were able to do this, if you were able to paint like 1.5 inches of wax on your body and then just step out, That's the wax shell that I arrange the dress onto. And I work with either a dress that's sewn, fabric, sometimes I sort of Frankenstein things together. I really like the sleeves from a dress from a thrift store, but the center part is too small, so I sew something to replace that. So I work, and that's where sort of the composition of the piece really happens there. It's the play of the gesture of the figure underneath and that dress on top. So that's wax shell, the dress on top. Then once I get it just right, I spray with hairspray. So that hardens up the fabric so that it's resistant enough that I can then go and paint wax on the outside and saturate it with wax, or sometimes I use resins. And that hardens the fabric. So you could basically like tap, tap, tap on it and it would be stable. Now that it's stable, I can do things like, let's say there's a wrinkle, and it would be dangerous if there's some sort of overhangs that make these big undercuts that would be very difficult to cast in glass well without trapping plaster. So I'll do something like I go and I fill under here, so you can see where my second hand is. I would fill under there to make that like a better flow. So all that underfilling, and I also fill the gap between my wax shell and the dress. So I actually inject wax with a surgical needle through the fabric and fill up all that area. But a little bit delicately because I don't want to pop. I could still when the resinated fabric is warm, if I injected too aggressively, it would push and bulge the form. So gently fill all of that, fill the undercuts. So that is what I call like my positive, that whole kit and caboodle. It's all connected as one piece. I divide it into segments, and then I take what's called a rubber mold with a mother mold. So I take that. So what I'll have in effect is on the outside, it'll be, from that rubber mold, I make a pure wax. So everything that was in fabric and everything is all recreated in the pure wax. And that pure wax is what I can use for casting. I tried initially casting from the cloth pieces, and it was too unreliable, to be honest. So once I get to the pure waxes, then I can make a plaster silica mold. That sets up, melt out the wax, and that's where the glass can be melted in. So that's the casting mold. And so that's basically from creating my positive to transforming it into glass. Or easier technically, but same steps, is creating a metal piece, an iron or a bronze piece. But that same dressing, resin, underfilling, so I can make the rubber mold that then makes the pure waxes.
I have a question. So with Chato, for instance, there's the braiding material in the top piece and the bottom. Is that purely just a practical situation, or is there any other thought given into where that break occurs?
That is the maximum height of the kiln for glass casting. So that's a technical consideration. Sometimes I'm able to put that right at the belt line or something like that, but not in that piece. And I always think, like, once I started looking for it, I noticed that, like, even all of the ancient Greek sculptures were like made in segments, and you can really see those seam lines of how the stone elements are stacked together. So I was like, okay, it's in keeping with how people have been making things.
Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, I've got one more on the chat. So someone wants to know if you've ever had a show at the Met. And no, oh, we need to do something about that. And what was your most challenging piece?
Okay. So I haven't had, let's say, I haven't had a show at the Met yet, right? But I love that museum and go there all the time, and it's a huge source of inspiration to me, especially their classical collection, and their contemporary as well. And my most challenging piece, let me think about it. Well, there is one piece. So there's a woman named Becky Benaroya who is an art collector and a philanthropist. And she lives out in Seattle, Washington. And her husband wanted to surprise her on, I think it was their 50th or 60th wedding anniversary, and have me cast her wedding dress in glass. So I thought that was amazing. He found it, he sent it to me like surreptitiously with an image of, she had sewn it, she saw a dress on the cover of a magazine from like the 1940s, sewed the dress herself. It was gorgeous, but it was voluminous. There was so much pleating on the front, and there was a long train, and it was so full. And like from a technical viewpoint, this piece was so difficult. Like it was just so hard. And the way the draping went, it was like all of these like beautiful drapes like this, but then underneath there was all of that space. And so I quietly worked away in my studio on this, and then did the first casting, and it was all done in secret. And the middle part failed. And I was like, oh no. So, and I had made a rubber mold and everything, so I could make another middle part, and it failed again. And then it was like more than a year into it. And, Jack is getting older. Becky is still with us, but Jack is getting older. He wasn't so well. And I think I worked on this piece for 5 years, casting and recasting. And, we always joked that it started as like a 50th wedding anniversary, and then ended up being the gift for like the 55th or the 60th wedding anniversary. And, thankfully, like it was a real race with time. And I got it done before he passed away, so they were able to enjoy that piece together. But that was, for me, like the most stressful art piece I had ever made in my life. And I think also probably technically one of the most difficult.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite the feat.
Pressure was on.
Yeah, I'm sure. Wow, that's amazing. Do you get a lot of commissions like that?
Not so much. And I'm not sure I would do it again, because it was so stressful. I was so worried all of the time about that casting. And, so no one has asked since, and like the commissions I do now are like for the cloud, for the Montenegro embassy or something like that, but it was an amazing dress, but I think for me it was just too stressful.
Yeah. One of the docents wanted to tell you that they were just, less of a question, but more that they've just been blown away with your work and fascinated with it ever since they saw an exhibit at the Hunter Museum.
Oh, wow.
We're so glad that we have 2 in our collection, and they always use one on the tours. And then another question came up. Could you share with us how you learned about fabric? It must drape differently depending on which fabric is used, and how does that affect your work in glass, ceramic, and metal? Is there something in your background that encouraged you to work with fabric in your art?
There's nothing in my background. My parents were both in the medical industry. My mom actually ran the emergency room at Bellevue Hospital in New York City in the 60s and 70s. And my dad was a cancer research doctor. So he studied cardiopulmonary cancer. So there's nothing directly in my background there. My mom was a fabulous dresser, I will say that. So really the work with fabric, I just, learned by doing in my studio. I read a little bit about draping, like I got a lot of fashion books and I had a few idols in the fashion world. Like one of them was Madame Brie, who was working in Paris around the end of World War II and end of World War II, and then came to the United States, and she's called the Sphinx of Fashion. She was a very eccentric character. She wore a turban, and she made these things called the Grecian gowns. And she took, I forget what kind of fabric she was using, but what I learned from her is there's the warp and the weft of the material, but if you want it to drape well, you turn it like this and you work on the bias. And that completely changes, that's what the bias means. I was like, everybody's like, don't cut on the bias, cut on the bias. I was reading all these instruction books and like how to make dresses, like I tried sewing clothes and everything. And I had no idea what that meant. So I finally understood that. So that means like in the sort of diamond way. I also, what I learned from Madame Brie was she worked a lot with knits, silk knit. So something that is knit versus something that is woven drapes in a much softer and more supple way. So for example, most polyesters, like I use a lot of polyester, like what you would consider like a low quality fabric, or a low desirability fabric, because those knits, when I turn them on the diagonal, you can just get such a great tight articulation of draping. And so the synthetic knits turned out to be for purely for draping, some of my favorite things. Then I went to other materials completely for texture. There were like some crushed silks and silks that like they were like quite thick that had like embroidery and stuff on them. And those actually took the process, if it was thick enough, they took the process of the hardening with the hairspray and then the resin very well. And that's another thing. Every fabric, I have a wall in my studio where it's my test wall. Every fabric that I bring in, I see how it drapes, and then I cut out a good, square of it, and I take it through the whole process. I put the hairspray, I put the wax, I put the resins, because sometimes there's actually like a chemical reaction and things will like frizzle or fry. Like one time, I remember I started putting resin on something and the whole thing just started smoking. It's like, oh no. And like holes were burning in. And I was like, is this thing about to catch on fire? Like literally. So things have happened like that, because, I don't know the technology or chemistry of fabric. I just know what it looks like, So I have had some really crazy things happen.
Maggie, do you have any questions?
No, I'm just fascinated about the almost catching your studio on fire. I just think that's fascinating. It's also scary to think about what chemicals might be in our clothing now that you say that. I'm questioning my choice of fabrics now, but fascinating.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Angie again, and I've been at the museum a week. So one week onto the job, that I'm so excited that I get to come here every day and see your piece as I now come to my museum job. So thank you for making my entrance to work every day so special. And I get to ask you a question. So I guess I'll start with, because I was in education for a very long time. So if there was a group of students standing around one of your pieces, what conversations would you like to hear? Or what would sort of, if you were to talk with, I guess the first part is what would you like to tell them about your work, and then what type of conversations would you like to hear them having?
Yes, that's excellent. So I'll start with the story. Like there was a docent at the De Young in San Francisco, and she sent me all these drawings. And she said, I was taking the kids through, and they were like, I don't know how old, 6, 7, or whatever. And I said to them, imagine the lady who is wearing this dress. And so the kids just went crazy and made all these drawings and everything. And I just thought, that's exactly it. Like, I love that idea of like imagining who would be in this dress, like where would they be going, or if you were in this dress, where would you be going, And I think the reason why I don't create, like fill the dress with a person is because it's literally like the invitation to imagine yourself or someone you love in that dress, I've heard so many boys say, oh, my mom wears a dress like that to go wherever, or a husband say, like, I see my wife in that dress, Some men see themselves in that dress. Like I've had that experience as well. There's one wild story where someone was going through a transition, like a sexual identity transition, and said that my dress played a key role for them, and I was like, wow, I never anticipated that. Never in my life, I always started, which I think is natural for most people, like from an autobiographical point of view, I was thinking about, how I felt like being dressed up or, getting ready to go somewhere, and, how different situations call for like a different dress. And it's like, you're almost like preparing yourself mentally when you're dressing to go out, And so I was really thinking about it from that point of view. So I loved that idea of, imagining who you saw in there, and just letting the kids go wild,
Yeah. That's pretty.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Somebody wanted to know, out of your 200 or so kimonos, do you have any left after?
I do. I came back from Japan with so many kimonos with the idea that they would not feel precious to me, that I would be able to work freely in the studio. And now they feel precious to me again. And it's like, oh, no. So I actually, and I do things like when I finished that first group of kimonos, I folded everything up. One of the first things you learn when you're learning about kimono is how to fold it. So I folded everything up perfectly as I was taught, put everything away. So now the kimonos are out of my eye range, as I'm working on other things. But one thing I was thinking about recently actually was the colors of the kimonos and color combinations that go, when you're laying your kimonos, or the background and the flowers and the imagery, So I started thinking, maybe I'll unfold some of those kimonos and just look at that color palette again, because it's a totally different color palette than how we dress in Europe or in America, And I thought, interesting that I'm thinking about that again in a different way. I would say I have one 60 centimeter palette with about 6 boxes of kimonos on it. So maybe I still have probably like 100 left or something. I know it doesn't sound like I should be so precious with them, but I just like them so much. So,
So you see yourself continuing to work with the kimono throughout your career?
I think once it's a part of your vocabulary, you'll never give it up completely. I was thinking I worked 3-dimensionally with the kimonos. Like I haven't worked with them in a flat way at all, and it's like such a flat garment. I haven't done anything like that, so I always feel like there's more to do,
Yeah. Any questions here? Did you ever do one like of a folded up kimono, like with all the pieces layered and?
No, I haven't done that yet, but I might, I don't know.
When you said stacks of them, that's what I was imagining, like stacks of glass folded.
I don't know. But as people are going through, like if anything ever comes up and you're showing people around and people have questions, it's easy to send me a question on my website or via email. And as I said, like I always answer my own email. It might take some time, but I do it. So feel free as questions come up to reach out to me.
Okay, we got one more that popped up.
Okay.
It says,
Let me interrupt for just a second. This is more of a comment, but I love the multiple layers of all your work. I happen to like a piece of work that makes me think about various things, and you go all the way, history, culture, present day concerns, and everything, and it's extraordinarily stimulating for me. So thank you.
Thank you. That is great. That is exactly what I'm aiming for. Like I feel like there's an on-ramp for everybody, no matter what you're looking at. If you're someone who's curious about materials or someone who cares about history or you've studied, culture or fashion, that, there's always a way to get to the work,
Okay, this other question says, being an artist is intense. What do you do to support your spirit outside of work?
I spend a lot of time walking outside. I would never call myself a hiker because that sounds more serious. But I do have hiking boots and special pants. And I go, wherever I am, I go out and take a walk and I just look at everything, I particularly like if I'm exhausted because I do get tired sometimes. There's an area in northern Italy that has low mountains, the Dolomites, and I really like to go there and just walk and breathe the air. The air is so clean, and I completely unwind there. And also, my friends are always involved in totally different things than I am. Like I have friends who are writers, friends who are actors. And so like I'll go see one of their performances and just sort of dive into their world for a second and then talk to them about all the things that are problematic or tiring for them. And I'm like, oh, look, it's someone else's life, So really friends, walking, and just staying healthy. Like I have a pretty healthy eating routine, and like I exercise, I do yoga or something cardio every morning. And when I stick to my routine, I'm very, very stable and I can sort of work and concentrate without much trouble.
That's good. Somebody else wanted to know how do you like living in Prague?
I like it. So we moved about 98, 99, 97 was the first time I visited Prague, and I was like, oh, this is an interesting place. So but what's happened is, although we've stayed in the same city, the city has changed so much that I said to my husband once, it's like we've moved 5 different times without ever leaving, When we first got there, it's definitely post-communist, and you could feel that vibe, and it had this like dark but kind of romantic and a little bit adversarial feel. I felt like I was in who wrote Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy? Yeah, I felt like I was in that, so, there was stuff going on. And then there started to be like this art scene. And we lived downtown at that point in Prague 1. And like there were these funky little galleries popping up. And that was sort of like version 2. Then came a lot of mass tourism. So downtown completely changed. And it was not that much fun to live there anymore. So we moved up the hill to this other neighborhood where we are now. And when we moved there, it was like kind of desolate. It was just us and, you know, an older population, most of whom had lived through communism there and everything. So the neighborhood was pretty subdued. Like we all minded our own business and everything. And then it had like a hipster gentrification transformation. And so that's where we're at now. So like within half a block of my house, I can go to 7 different stores for a cup of coffee. It's like, holy mackerel, like that kind of choice. Like when I think back to version 1, when I was living in downtown Prague, when it was like, you know, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, like, I never imagined that that would be a possibility, you know? So here it is, you know. So now I think it feels much more like any other European city. The architecture is really amazing, you know, because it wasn't decimated during World War II. That's the one thing. But when you go out and walk around and look at all the buildings, you get an architecture lesson in just walking around, you know. So.
That's amazing. I've heard a lot of people recently say that Prague is their favorite European city to visit.
Yeah, it's really amazing. It's
so
amazing.
History is still there. Do you have pieces on display near where you live?
No, which is another interesting thing. You know, the museums seem to be really focused on the local artists, which makes sense. You know, they're representing Czech art to the rest of the world. So that's the focus.
Anybody else have questions? Comments? Just want to say how much we love your work. Really, like yours is one that ends up on almost every tour, and even if we didn't intend it to be part of the tour, somebody in the audience will stop and want to talk about it because it just catches people's eyes and it fascinates them. And love getting questions from kids. Like, you know, I'll stop and ask them if they know, you know, like with Shadow, what it is representing. And we get everything from some kids recognize it as a kimono and others say it looks like Jesus or it looks like Star Wars because it's like a robe.
That's great.
And our other favorite question, because our galleries are a little bit chilly, we get asked if it's an ice sculpture sometimes.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
We're always like, no, but it's cold enough in here that it could be. So it's always a fun one for conversation starters.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Well, thank you all so much. And as I said, you know, if anything comes up, moving on into the future, I am always available.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for doing this for us.